All right, welcome to the podcast. So today I've got Robyn O'Brien on, and I became aware of her, years and years ago. And when you hear her story, you'll really get why, because she is a driving force behind what's going on with our food supply, food allergies, Monsanto, and she is truly a warrior mom. I met her, I think I reached out to her like 5 years ago as I was coming out with the Virgin Diet, and we became friends. And then I actually got to meet her in person last year. I didn't even know she was going to be at an event I was at. And she told her story again, and it just was like, oh my gosh, wait till you hear this. So let me tell you a little bit about her. She is an author, an analyst, and a mother of four. She had 4 kids under 5 at one point. She began her career in finance in the food industry. You're going to hear about that. And then she had issues with her youngest child and discovered that her child had extreme food allergies. What she didn't know was what her child was allergic to. And that's going to be the big aha in this interview. What came out of that was she became kind of the reluctant hero, didn't want to do what she was called to do, finally was like, okay, I have to do this. Wrote the book, The Unhealthy Truth. She's got a podcast, Takeout, with Ashley and Robyn. And she is really out there fighting for, information on food, better food supplies, organic food, etc. And we're going to give you some great resources in the show notes. So if you go to jjvirgin.com/the unhealthy truth, you'll be able to get her guide to, it's kind of a 101 on organic food, everything you need to know. All right, let's do it. Welcome to the show, Robyn. I'm so glad you're here with me today.
Oh, JJ, thanks so much for having me.
Well, we finally had to stop. I mean, just for everybody listening, we were talking so much offline. I'm like, okay, see it.
I know. Save it.
Yeah, save it. Stop talking. So I had the good fortune. When did I get introduced to you? Like 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, because you were my hero, still are. And then last year, I finally got to meet you in person and got to hear you. I knew your story, but I got to hear you tell it in person. And that is really where I want to start, because it is just like such an inspiring warrior mom story. So, you came from corporate America. You were in finance. You're from Texas. You were working on a team that managed $20 billion in assets, and you're doing pretty different. You had to this big shift. So what happened?
Well, exactly. So I grew up in Texas in a really conservative family. I'd gone to business school on a full scholarship. I was actually recruited by Exxon and Enron out of business school, and, wasn't at all dialed into anything food or anything environmental. I took a job on the equity desk, and our team managed $20 billion in assets. And it was with this just absolutely amazing team of guys. And I loved them. And they said, you're the only woman on the team. You're going to cover food. And I thought, you guys, I drink Diet Coke. I am not the right person for this. Totally not a good idea. I burn noodles. I can't do this. And they were like, you're covering food. And so they had me cover the food industry and a lot of the companies that would come through our offices, whether pitching an IPO or they were looking for additional investment capital. And so I would sit in these meetings listening to these management teams talk about their business models. And it was very, very black and white. And I liked it that way. At that point, it was business school, it was analytical. I hadn't had kids yet, and black and white was really safe. And I could kind of hide behind these 5 computer terminals that we sat behind every day and just do the analysis. And so, as I did, I saw how these companies were driving profitability by taking the real ingredients out, swapping in the artificial ingredients. Everybody believed that everything was safe. After all, we have an FDA, and we just assumed that everything had been tested and regulated and tested for kids and everything else. And so I just learned these models, these business models, and these management teams. And then kind of fast forward a couple of years, we were pregnant with our first child, and I grew up in Houston, and my husband's from Seattle, and we thought, we want to be somewhere that's ours, that is new to both of us. And we ended up landing in Colorado. And so, as we got out here 17 years ago, Colorado's been ahead of the curve on a lot of this stuff. And I truly felt like I had landed on another planet. Everybody was talking about organic, and I just thought, this has to be some hippie thing or some hobby thing, or, it just.
Careful, Robyn. I grew up in Berkeley.
Well, yeah. So the stereotypes around these cultures. Yes. Exactly. And so,
right.
I came into it and I was thinking, okay, if I have to put cloth napkins in the lunchbox, there were a lot of rules. And I kind of had to fall in line because we lived here. But still, there was probably a lot of smack talk on the side that was going on. And I thought, I want to go back into finance. We were relocating and we had just had our first baby. And so, typical me, which is, type A and going after what you want to achieve, I thought, if I'm going to stay home and have kids, then I want to do this really fast. And we knew we wanted a big family. So we had our 4 kids in 5 years, which is complete insanity. It's just total insanity. But as any mom listening to this knows, like, you really at that point don't want anybody telling you what to feed your kids, because it's enough. I mean, you're so wiped most of the time, literally just trying to get them to bed, fed, safe, not cracking their heads on the side of something. You really are just like in this survival mode. And so I really was not at all sensitive to anybody that was suggesting certain dietary things for these kids. And then, as life tends to do, it knocks you down and brings you to your knees so that you can bow your head and learn a lesson. And that's exactly what happened. My youngest child one morning over breakfast was just getting fussy. And I had made scrambled eggs, Lego my Eggo waffles, and these tubes of blue yogurt. And, when I'd been on the equity desk, we'd actually had the privilege of meeting Martha Stewart when she took her company public. And it was sort of funny to me because I thought, making scrambled eggs was about as Martha Stewart as I could get. I just didn't have that attribute in my DNA. And so, that morning I was sort of whipping up these scrambled eggs because it's kind of the extent of what I could do. And she got really fussy and I thought she was just tired. I put her down for a nap. And for some reason, I still don't know why, I went up and checked on her that morning and her face was swollen shut. And so I turned to the older 3 kids who were still, 3, 4, and 5 at the time. And I just asked what they put in her face because I thought they might have sprayed something at her or done something. And they were so blank in their stares. And that's when I got really scared because it was obvious something systemic was happening. So I raced her to the emergency room. And the pediatrician starts going on about these, food allergies, and she's having an allergic reaction. And what did I feed the kids for breakfast? And, the analyst in me, like, she's starting to sort of rattle off these numbers. And I'm just kind of thinking, like, since when? Like, when did this happen? Because when we were kids, we all had PB&J and carton of milk, and it wasn't some death sentence sitting on a cafeteria lunchroom table. Those weren't loaded weapons. And here we were, fast forward, all of a sudden, all these kids, and she's rattling off these statistics. And in that moment, I still remember so clearly standing in the pediatrician's office thinking, how am I going to be a mom? How can I protect my child if she can't eat? How can I protect this child from these 3 older siblings that aren't even old enough to read, who may accidentally hand her something, not knowing that the ingredients, said that this contained something that could cause her harm? And so it was just this moment of absolute terror and panic and fear and inadequacy. And everything that I thought motherhood was going to look like on that day changed. And I realized that the kind of this carefree thought that I had that was going to be part of what motherhood had been up until that point would be gone. And so, we got her under control. I came home that afternoon and I sat down to try to learn everything about food allergies that I could learn. And as I started pulling that data, I mean, it was shocking, JJ, how pervasive this has become. And now, 12 years later, I mean, we know, we see the skyrocketing price of EpiPen, and we know the fact that that's $1 billion brand. Yeah. We know the CDC has now reported in a 10-year period, a 265% increase in the rate of hospitalization. So we know this now. We have the data now. But at that point in time, people were still dismissing it or saying moms were making it up. And I thought, how am I going to keep my kids safe?
So you have this realization, and I still remember when I first started to find out about food intolerance, which wasn't called that at the time.
Right.
No one really knew what it was. And literally people were like, thought I was making this up. And I'm like, I keep seeing this over and over again. At the time we were doing testing, but everyone thought it was an outright food allergy. They didn't understand the difference between an allergy and intolerance or sensitivity. I mean, we've learned so much just over the last even 5 years, just in the languaging. But I'm sure back then, I mean, first you had to realize yourself that it was a real thing, but then, and fortunately, honestly, that you were in Colorado. Right. So there you were. What did you do next as you started to dig into this? Because your whole background was.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was just so stunned by the statistics and the numbers. Back in 2006 when it happened, they were saying it's 1 in 17 kids. Well, now they're saying 1 in 13 and maybe 1 in 11. It's 2 kids in every classroom, and I'm thinking, this is an epidemic and genetics don't change this quickly. So what's changed? And
no. And here's the thing, Robyn, that's just the outright allergy. What about all the intolerances?
Exactly. And so then as I started learning about all of that, I don't talk about this often, but I do remember in that very, very early stage, as I was learning about the chronic inflammation of food allergies and what that kind of the alarm systems that are going off in the immune system, I remember thinking to myself, before I had really started to dive into it, I remember thinking, is this an early indicator for something? And what happens if a child's body lives in this constant state of inflammation? What happens? And I remember thinking that, and those are still a lot of big questions that are still out there in the scientific community. What is chronic low-lying inflammation doing to us? And we really are starting to understand it can be very severe. And so, that fear again of that gripping fear of like, this, how do I take care of this? How do I protect my child, not only from these acute food allergies that could literally send her into anaphylaxis where her body system shut down, but how do I protect her from this kind of chronic, silent, low-lying inflammation too? And so at that point, the first act was, how do I protect my child? And, just as any warrior mom knows, like you go deep on that. You're just, everything in you goes after those answers, what you can do, the teams you need to be with, the allies you need to find. And so, it was still early on in this whole food allergy thing, and there were not very many groups or organizations. And there was one based in Washington, D.C. And so, I reached out to them. And they were a little bit hands off. And I just thought, oh, I'm sure they probably get approached by a lot of moms all the time and are probably tired of hearing all of our stories. So I sort of dismissed it. And then I kept reaching out, kind of trying to say, hey, can we start something here in Colorado? What can we be doing? Because the awareness is not where it needs to be. The education is not where it needs to be. And I kept getting this weird pushback from this organization. And as I started speaking with other mothers, I realized they were getting it too. So I was like, that doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel right. These should be their foot soldiers. We are their foot soldiers. Why are they holding us at arm's length? And so I did what I knew how to do coming from this finance world, and I pulled their financial statements. And that's when the next chapter happened. I learned that this nonprofit based in D.C. Was funded by Kraft, and its medical advisors were working for a company I had never heard of at that point called Monsanto. So I'm thinking, okay.
What was this nonprofit supposed to be about?
It was supposed to be about food allergy awareness. And, they've since sort of gone through a name change and a bunch of other stuff. And they do a good job still of food allergy awareness and really making sure that everybody has an EpiPen. It's, I kind of look at it as a marketing arm for some of these pharmaceutical companies and making sure we all have EpiPens and things like that, which is fine. And that is needed. But there were so many other voices and so many other places where organizations were needed. And I thought, they're not covering this whole thing. And so as I started looking into why Kraft would fund their website and what their allergists were doing with a company like Monsanto, which I had never heard of, I set up the same system I'd had when I'd been a financial analyst, where I was capturing headlines and capturing data every single day. And you just were able to sort of pull these filters. So every morning I'd wake up and I'd have a list of emails in my inbox that were related to food allergies and food sensitivities, kind of leading researchers, anything that was going on at the government, in the agencies with the research. And in October 2006, an email came through, and the EPA had just issued a very small grant of just over $440,000 to a university in Michigan. And the title of the article was, Do Genetically Engineered Foods Cause Food Allergies? And honestly, JJ, at that point I'm thinking, what's a genetically engineered food? I mean, we hadn't talked about it when I'd cover the food industry. What is this? I started diving into that. And I actually called the researcher at Michigan State University. And I said, I'm new to this space and here because of my child. What do I need to know? And I remember him saying, we haven't developed the animal testing models to know whether or not the novel proteins, they're not knowingly going to insert some allergen into a food, but in the process of that insertion process, the genetic disruption that can occur can create things that they didn't even have names for. And he said, those are the things we don't know. We just don't know. And I just remember thinking, are you kidding me? This stuff has been in our food supply. At this point, I knew for 10 years, the first GMOs were introduced in the mid 1990s. This was by the end of 2006. And they were only just starting to ask these questions because the animal testing model hadn't existed. So, here it had been in our food
Isn't
system
that mind
for 10
blowing? I
years.
mean, that is mind
Totally,
blowing.
and so mind blowing that even JJ in Boulder, people were like, what? They knew they were eating organic food, but the fact that we had been eating this genetically engineered food for a decade and no one really knew was so mind blowing that people didn't want to believe it. They really did not want to believe it. And so, as I started looking into other countries around the world, and I've been so fortunate in my work and research to travel, especially before we had kids, I'm realizing, other countries either never allowed these ingredients into their food system in the first place, or they labeled them so that consumers could make an informed choice. So
That's the craziest part. At least
exactly. And, I think if you're kind of approaching this from a legal angle, if you wanted to have traceability, liability, and accountability, you would definitely label these things. If you're approaching it from a legal angle and you do not want traceability, you do not want accountability, and you do not want liability, then you fight really hard not to label them, because there is no post-market surveillance. There's no way, once these things are entered into the marketplace, if they are not labeled, for us to know conclusively, yes, that triggered a food allergy. They can always say it could be a host of things. There's no label on that. There's no way to know conclusively. And so as a business model, what I was realizing was that these guys were just insanely brilliant. And so, by not labeling these new ingredients, no alarm sounded. No consumers kind of said, hey, I'm not sure I want to eat that stuff. And then on top of that, what they had been selling up until that point, their signature product was this Roundup weed killer. And so by genetically engineering the seeds and giving them these new attributes, the first kind of generation of these GMO crops enabled, they called them Roundup Ready crops, Roundup Ready soy and Roundup Ready corn. And it enabled an increased application of this weed killer, this herbicide known as Roundup. So I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, wow, as an analyst, that top line growth just went off the charts because they've introduced seeds where they can spray more and more and more of their signature product Roundup. I mean, that is so smart. As a business model, the board would have all been just giving each other high fives. And then on top of that, you now have these seeds that contain this patented trait. So instead of farmers simply buying the seeds, they also have to sign these what are called technology stewardship agreements, where they are licensing the use of that trait and they're licensing the use of that technology. And I'm thinking, this is absolutely genius as a business model, because you have suddenly created a whole bunch more revenue lines. And that's exactly what they did. And so, as I was starting to pull the data at that point, we were 10 years into this in the US, and the USDA was reporting on the adoption of genetically engineered crops just off the charts. And then the application of glyphosate, which is the signature ingredient in their Roundup products, off the charts. And I'm thinking, we have absolutely done this on the backs of our country and nobody knows.
Now we're just starting to really hear about it.
And I think, you think about how long it took for the tobacco industry to be exposed for what they did. And it's very similar, the tobacco science that the industry funded, telling our grandmothers that cigarettes were safe. We see the same thing here, where it's industry funded science and industry funded scientists. And a fascinating way to sort of noodle into it is to really go to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And that was really sort of the clincher, because, the companies like Monsanto are saying these are substantially equivalent. They use that term to basically suggest that their genetically engineered Roundup Ready soy is substantially equivalent, more or less the same, to any soy that's already been out there in the food system for hundreds of years. That's their argument, consumer facing. And yet at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, they are issued patents because of the distinct characteristics of that Roundup Ready soy product. And those patents are what protect the revenue stream because of the novelty of that invention. So they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth.
So you find all this out and you're putting two and two together about what's going on with your daughter. What do you do?
This is where a lot of our worlds kind of come together. So I froze. And I remember feeling like I was in the bottom of a well, curled up in a fetal position. at that point, my husband and my kids knew and understood because they were seeing me go through this research day in and day out.
And how old were your kids at the time?
They were 1, 3, 4, and 5. And it was an incredibly isolating time. I can remember the first scientist that I spoke with who said, I have research on the impact of genetically engineered seeds on the butterflies. And I can remember when they were lifelines, to realize that there were scientists that have been covering this. And when I was saying this food allergy nonprofit was funded by Kraft and Monsanto, I cannot tell you how many of the scientists were like, oh my gosh, now it makes sense. And so it was just this missing piece of a story that a lot of people were experiencing, but it hadn't pulled together. And I remember meeting with different people thinking, who can I find to tell the story? Who can I find to tell the story? I don't want to tell the story. Again, from a very conservative upbringing, not extroverted, I really didn't want to tell the story. I wanted to go back to the safety of finance. And I met with a lot of different people. I remember meeting with a businessman here in Boulder, and he was in the tech world. His son had a really severe peanut allergy. And I was sitting in his office one day, just an absolute shell of who I am, because it had been so draining and so terrifying. And I really just looked like a shell of who I am. And I remember he walked me to the elevator and he said, the faster you get your head around the fact that this is your story to tell, the better off we're all going to be. And I just, and like the elevator was shut, it was so powerful, but I didn't want to own my own story. I didn't want to own my own story. And people were saying, reach out to Erin Brockovich. You should reach out to Erin Brockovich. And I'm thinking, half the world at this point thinks this is just crazy talk. Like, why would Erin Brockovich believe this? And, you send some random email through a website, like that's going to work. But, being super type A because yeah, exactly.
And
the drive
mom.
inside to protect our children is something that the company that figures out how to harness that, man, they're off the charts, because it is, right? You can't stop it. And there were times where I really wished that I could have. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, looking out into the backyard at the kids and thinking, if I don't do this, who will? And so I sat down, it was right at Christmas time, and I spent 2 weeks trying to draft this email to Erin Brockovich, because I was like, I come from a really credible background, and this is going to sound totally unbelievable. And how do I present this in a way that she understands? And given her experience, I knew that if anybody was going to understand, it was going to be Erin Brockovich, but it just was such a shot in the dark. And so I ended up just kind of iterating on this email until I got it to a place where I felt like it was digestible. And I sent it off, and you send those emails, you don't know if somebody's going to reply. And she did reply a few days later. And she said, at this point I thought I could give it to her and she could use her platform to get the story out. In her reply, she said, I'm so glad someone has finally taken this on. I lost my brother when he was 37 years old to a food allergic reaction. And I thought, I remember sitting at the dining room table and I looked at my husband and I'm like, how do you explain this? That I suddenly had somebody saying, thank you for taking this on. Somebody like Erin who,
You're like, wait a minute.
And so she had given so much, to so many. And I also realized at that point, like, we all have to do our part, and that I did have to do this, and only I could tell that story that had happened to me. And so, at that point, I started pulling together the research. I can remember the first time I hit send on an email blast, thinking, people are going to think this is crazy. And then I spent about a month pulling it together for Robert Kennedy, because he has children with asthma and food allergies. The concern I had was that his allergist was one of the men who had worked for Monsanto. And I knew that he didn't know that because he had sued them on different issues environmentally. And so I literally bound an entire presentation, business school style, at FedEx Kinko's. And I mailed it off to Kennedy thinking, at least I can get sort of a legal perspective on this, and also that of a dad. And we went to Texas to see my family for spring break. And I said, I'll be home April 2nd. And sure enough, the phone rang, and it was his office, and it was his chief of staff. And she had me on speakerphone. And to this day, I don't even know who was in the room that day. And they just said, this is absolutely incredible. This is an unbelievable story. Will you come on the radio show Ring of Fire? And, I was terrified. And I thought, who we have to be brave enough to tell these stories. Our kids don't have the platform. And so I went on that radio show, and for those that know Kennedy, he has a speech, something wrong with his vocal cords in his speech. And I didn't know that until he started to talk. And in that moment, I thought, this is just a dad. This is just a guy who's had to overcome his own things, no matter if he's a Kennedy, but like, he's still just a dad. And in that moment, I was like, this is going to be fine. And so we had this conversation. And then that sort of catalyzed and launched the next thing, which was speaking at an event in Chicago. And from there, it just started to gain traction, and people started to hear the story. And I think a huge part of it is I have this finance background. And so to kind of understand the cost benefit analysis of what was done, it's any business model. And they were just particularly brilliant at it. The first generation of these genetically engineered crops are proving to be a disaster across so many different fields. The farmers now have crops that no longer respond to glyphosate and Roundup. So they're having to up-level the chemical doses that they're applying to these crops. We're worried now about runoff and golf. I mean, there's so many things that are starting to happen. And, as I was coming through that first year, or the first year and a half, I remember thinking, I'll get back to finance. If I can get this out enough, I'm going back to managing money because I loved it and that's what I want to do. And, as it kept going, even by the time I wrote my book, and that was published in 2009, and they pushed it out in paperback in 2010, I still at that point thought, I've given my research, like I've done the work. I'll go back to what I had planned. And there was just this pull for what had happened personally, combined with the professional experience I'd had in finance and the way that I was able to talk about it. And I talk a lot about this, as mothers, it's that old airplane thing where you have to put your oxygen mask on first before you can help others. And I think, when we get out of the hospital with that newborn baby, they need to hand you a debit card for guilt because you're constantly jockeying mentally, on the guilt between, the time you need to take care of yourself and the time that you need to devote to take care of the well-being of your children. And in those first early years, it was so stripping to give and give and give. It's like that old story, the giving tree stump, and I did that, and it absolutely stripped me in so many ways physically. And I remember this is where Boulder is just so supremely great. A friend of mine at the gym happens to be a 6-time Ironman. And he pulled me aside one day and he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I don't think so. And I don't know what to do." And so he literally, got me going on a nutrition program. And it had been his best friend who was the scientist, the very first scientist that I spoke to. So he had just been this guardian angel the whole way through. And he got me kind of paying attention. He's like, "Robyn, if you really want to do this, you have to take care of yourself the way any athlete would." And it was such an obvious aha moment, but it meant so much coming from somebody who had just conquered a sport and done so much. So, really at that point, I realized that part of my job was to take care of myself, because this is not something that we could fix in 5 years or 10 years, that it was probably going to take a generation. And that if I was really going to be in it to win it, part of my job every day would be self-care. And so I started to look for models of people who have been in their work for decades like that. And the woman who came to mind was Jane Goodall. And I thought, when she started her work in her 20s with monkeys and apes, people would have thought she was absolutely bananas. And yet she went back and got her PhD in her 50s. And now you look at her as just this gracious, eloquent, incredible woman who has devoted her life to her work and to that cause. And so I'm a big believer in finding people that can be role models across all different areas of your life. And so, Jane Goodall was definitely one of those people where I thought, she's taken extraordinary care of herself so that she can take care of that work. And it was a huge lesson that I learned in the early years.
That is the biggest biggest takeaway. That is the biggest takeaway for everyone to really hear is that if we want to go out there and do the best for our kids, the best thing we can do for our kids is be amazing role models. Right? I mean, and people talk about they want their kids to be healthy, and then they're not eating healthy, they're not exercising, they won't have healthy kids. And if you really want to be the best for your kids and you want to go out there and make a difference in the world, the first place you've got to start is with yourself. When my son was in the hospital, I remember looking at the situation. Here he is in a coma. I've got to make my book work. I'm the financial support for my family. And my thought was, my self-care has to be 110%. I have to put myself above everything else. That oxygen mask has to go on first. And, that was the first 4.5 months in the hospital, but it's been 5 years since. And for all of us, it's not a sprint. Like, you initially were in this, and I'm sure your adrenaline was going crazy as you're starting to discover all this. And then there's that shift realization where you go, oh my gosh, this isn't what I'm going to do now. This is not going away.
Yeah. And I think, the first thing that we think we need to do is sacrifice ourselves. But, in the end, that doesn't serve the mission. It doesn't serve the work, and it doesn't serve the children. And so I had to really shift in my mindset to realize that self-care was in the best interest of the mission, the work, my family, my children, and to put it into my day as any important meeting. And that shift happened. And I think, to truly be honest with yourself and know, I had to be really honest and say, I can't fix this in 5 years. I can't fix it by myself. I'm going to have to build out a team, and this is going to take generations to convert our farmland. Less than 1% of the farmland in the U.S. is organic. We're not going to be able to change that overnight, but it is very fixable because it only takes 3 years to convert that farmland. But you're going to need a lot of allies and a lot of organizations, a lot of businesses, a lot of people talking about this. And I think what's extraordinary right now is that, you and I, when we were talking about this a decade ago, it was still pretty fringy. And now, I know, 82% of households are buying organic, and you have companies like Kroger whose highlight in their earnings model is that simple truth, free from organic private label brand that they're rolling out in all their stores. I mean, that is absolutely the highlight. Every single earnings call, that's the highlight. Yeah. And so the business community is responding. The corporations are starting to respond. We're seeing massive acquisitions just of these just jaw-dropping numbers, whether it's Annie's for $800 million, Applegate for $775 million. But it's companies like General Mills and Hormel that were really not on board with this message a decade ago that are now saying, you know what? We missed it. Yeah, we're buying in. And so
they have to be.
It's fascinating. The pivot that's happening is truly fascinating. And I think the opportunity as a country is how do we shift our supply chain fast enough to really kind of keep up with this demand? Because right now we're importing all of this. We're importing it from China and Uruguay and Australia. And I look at that and I think, food security is national security. And food security is so much more than just calories. It is nutrition. So how do we build out a nutritious food supply here in the U.S. and treat it like a national security issue, which it is? Because, better than anybody. It's like the statistics of drug use in America, pharmaceutical drug use, is absolutely off the charts. And I think, as we learn that the greatest form of healthcare is what we choose to put on our fork, you start to realize, I think back to who I was and that mom that was like, I had all these antacids in my cupboard and all these, headache medicine and all this stuff. And my skin was a disaster, and it's like, don't know. And I think if you can open that up, if somebody can realize, maybe you don't have an acute milk allergy, but that sensitivity that you have to milk is maybe contributing to your chronic acne or chronic indigestion or stomach issues or whatever, I think I was so afraid of change. And now I look at it and I'm like, that is truly where the magic happens, whether it's your own health, to try it on, see how it is for a couple weeks to not have gluten and dairy, see how you feel. And at the end of those 2 weeks, if you want to go back, no one's going to make you stay. You can always go back. But I think there's so many simple little things that we can do.
And I know we are way over the clock. And I'm looking at this going, okay, we're definitely doing part 2, Robyn. We're setting it up. And I don't want to leave anyone hanging. This story is so powerful, but it's like a story of courage, of being a warrior mom, of putting yourself first, of just turning over the stones. And then once you know it, you can't unsee it. And then being brave enough to talk about it and share when you know what you're saying is opposite of everything that people are hearing. So now it's getting to be more and more accepted, especially with the people we run with, but it's getting out there. And so what I'd love to do now is definitely for everybody listening, we will be doing part 2 of this, but I know that you're also going to be providing everyone in the show notes. We'll have some great show notes and cheat sheet, and we'll also have Robyn's 101 primer on organic food, what you need to know. So you'll get all of that too. So you can start putting some of this into motion, because this does change everything. And I know we have a lot of moms listening, but people really wanting to change their health. And this is the single most critical thing you can do for your health, is obviously what you eat. It is, there's nothing more important. So we're going to give you access to all of that. And I want to thank you so much. Your story is so big. And every time I hear you, it's like, it just gets bigger and more information. But also, I know that you've got a lot of actionable information too, which is critical, because there's no point in hearing this and getting
totally.
afraid.
And one of the things I think another lesson that was so important was, as I was trying to sort of clean out the cabinets and clean out the kitchen, I also had to clean out some of the thoughts in my head. And, my hashtag I use a lot is dump the junk. Well, you've also got to dump the junky thoughts out of your head, that you're not worth it, or you can't do it, or you're not the one who's going to be able to do something. The scope of the system and the scope of the health issues that we're seeing in our country, I truly believe mothers have such extraordinary insight, and we all have skills and talents to lend. And so to really, remind yourself that you really do matter, because I think if you're really going to take care of yourself, you have to believe that you matter, and to know that, the insight, the knowledge that you have in your own experience is absolutely going to help somebody else. And in some ways, we do it kind of friend to friend, sister to sister, neighbor to neighbor. For some of us, we have these bigger platforms. And I truly, truly believe that all of these voices matter right now as we really work to shift the system.
I'm glad you brought that up. The biggest challenge I had in my community when I asked them if they weren't as healthy as they wanted to be, why not? It was because they didn't feel worthy. And it's like, if you have that for yourself, then, if you don't feel worthy enough, extend it and say, would I do this for my kids? And, build it from there. Because again, you started all this because you wanted to help your kids. And a lot of times we'll start there and then realize that you cannot go out and take care of your kids without taking care of yourself. So that's where it all starts, just like you said. So I super appreciate that. Again, we're going to have, and what we'll do is we'll put it at jjvirgin.com/The Unhealthy Truth, which is Robyn's book, The Unhealthy Truth. So jjvirgin.com/The Unhealthy Truth. We're going to have the show notes. We'll have access to the 101 guide on organic food, everything that you need to know. We will find another time to continue the conversation. Consider this part 1 of a probably 10-part series on what's going on with food and then what we can do about it. And Robyn, thank you so much for your time today. Super appreciate it. You're just amazing. Such a warrior, a role model, and inspiration.
JJ, I mean, it's so mutual. And I think we, we really need each other. And so if we can help, create a place where other women feel safe to come forward and share their stories and share their vulnerabilities, and then tap into that to start to move all of this forward. It really, I think, is an incredible opportunity for our generation of women. I love the Warrior Mom badge, 100% behind you on that. So thanks for everything you do.
Thank you. And everyone stay with me, because after the break, I'm going to be answering a listener's question.
When you make a small change to something you do every day, the impact over time can be huge. And when it comes to breakfast, you don't want to blow it, because your breakfast sets the pace for your entire day. That's why JJ created the all-in-one plant-based breakfast shake to start your day right. Whether you are vegan, vegetarian, or just looking to consume more plant-based foods, this breakfast shake is for you. It comes in 3 delicious flavors, vanilla, chocolate, and chai, and helps give you sustained energy, cuts cravings, and can melt pounds from your waistline. Visit jjvirgin.com/products to shift your fat loss and energy into high gear today.
Welcome back. This is the time where I answer a listener's question, and today's question comes from Kara in Lexington. And Kara says, JJ, I'm trying to eat healthier, and I know that I should be eating organic, but I am on a food budget. What do I do? So here's the deal, Kara, and I'm glad you brought this up. It's kind of one that whenever I see it, I always wanted to attack this question because I actually believe that you can eat healthy for less money. Even if it was the same amount of money or slightly more, still obviously worth it because of the long-term savings and difference in your health, which is priceless. But there are so many tricks that you can do to be able to eat healthy on a budget. The first thing I'm going to recommend is that you go to EWG.org. That's the Environmental Working Group. And what they do is they publish each year the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. So they tell you those foods that absolutely you must eat organic because they are really like frankenfoods. They're the big GMO crops and the ones that are heavily sprayed and big pesticides. So that's the first place you're going to go is where do I need to spend my money? And then we've got all sorts of great resources. So the first thing I always say is go to your local farmer's market or join one of the CSAs, the collectives, where they will deliver food to you and find out, who is doing food organically. Get to know your farmers because some of them are doing it. They're just not certified because that's a whole expensive thing to do. So get to know your farmers and see who's farming correctly and see what you can do. And if you have room to do a garden, and my gosh, my son has become really good at hydroponics and vertical gardening. So it's amazing what you can do in a small amount of space to see if you can add some of the, key things that you like to eat the most there. So I look at that. I look at what's on sale. I go to the local farmers markets. I also fill my freezer full of my buddies over at Butcher Box. I like to use them because, first of all, best deal. I haven't found a place to get pastured pork, chicken, and beef and wild beef anywhere at the price point they do it. And so I just get a box of that delivered each month and I put it in the freezer and then I pull out something from the freezer each night, either from them or Vital Choice, my wild fish resource. And then I've got either my sweet potatoes or my squash or my wild rice. And then I make some veggies. And honestly, it's really quick to do these things and super inexpensive. The expensive food is having a bunch of food that goes bad. So you got to get really good at knowing how much you're going to use and then freezing the rest, batch cook, or processed food. That's where a lot of the expense goes. So again, find those resources. We've got a lot of great resources, Butcher Box being one of them. And then batch cook, buy things in bulk whenever possible, use your freezer, watch for sales, and you'll be amazed at how inexpensive it can become to eat healthy. All right. Thank you so much for that, Kara. I love when that question comes up. I'll probably always answer it whenever I hear it. And if you would like to submit a question, just head on over to my Facebook page. It is at JJ Virgin Official. Look for the blue check. That's me. Moi. And also you can go over to Instagram. So we watch there. We answer questions when we see them. I do Facebook Lives. I'm answering questions. And then we watch for great questions that we can pull onto the podcast too. Speaking of the podcast, this is the gratitude portion next. And I'll tell you what, we super appreciate the whole team when you leave reviews. First of all, it helps other people decide to listen in. But also, it's like how we get our grades, we all go through, it makes us all feel really good. So I super appreciate you for leaving the reviews. And I just want to do a shout out today. We always feature one every podcast. This one's a shout out to Sandy Gascon from Canada. She says, love, 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 5 stars. JJ is an amazing podcast host. Love the guests and the wide range of topics. Such great information. Cool. Thank you, Sandy. And hopefully you'll see me. I'm going to be speaking in Canada with TD Jakes and Tony Robbins. I'm excited about that. And if you would be so kind to submit a review, it helps a bunch. Social proof is everything. I would super appreciate that. You just go over to iTunes, and while you're there, leaving that review, go ahead and share too. Subscribe and share it with your pals. Thank you. This is how we get this thing out to the world. And, knowledge is power out there. So the more we get out there, the better. All righty. See you next week.